This week, we air a pre-recorded interview with Jeff Pollard, Vice President, Principal Analyst on the Security and Risk team, and Jess Burn, Principal Analyst, both from Forrester Research, to discuss the future of the CISO. In this two-part interview, we discuss the 6 most common types of CISOs, including the characteristics and competencies of each type. In part 2, we discuss aligning to the right type of CISO and exit strategies for CISOs who no longer wish to be CISOs. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. IT professionals, mark your calendars. Zero Trust World 2025 is happening in Orlando, Florida, February 19th to 21st. This event is tailored for IT leaders and cybersecurity experts who want actionable insights on zero trust strategies, practical solutions for modern threats, and meaningful connections with industry peers. Plus, take advantage of on-hand Cyber Hero boot camps, expert-led sessions, and the chance to earn CPE credits and your Cyber Hero certificate. Save $200 on your in-person registration using discount code ZTWSW25 at securityweekly.com/ZTW2025. Reserve your spot now. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 379, recorded January 14th, 2025, but will air on January 20th, 2025. It's not only Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but it's Inauguration Day and the College Football Playoff National Championship game, which is where I plan to be. Hi, I'm your host, Matt Alderman, and joining me for this interview segment is my co-host, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Matt. Great to see you twice in 1 week.
I know, 2 days in a row. I have my Buckeyes shirt on again today, so I'm going back to back. Just in case anybody who wonders who I'm rooting for, we say OH, and the response is IO.
trying to work in as much as you possibly can. I love that. Looking forward to conversation today.
I have to. Jeff Pollard primarily contributes to Forrester's offerings for security and risk professional. He leads Forrester's research on the role of the CISO, specializing in topics related to security strategy, budgets, metrics, business cases, and presenting to the board. Jess Burn is a principal analyst at Forrester, serving security and risk professionals. She contributes to Forrester's research on the role of the CISO with a focus on security talent management. Jeff and Jess, welcome back to Business Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having us again.
Thanks for continuing to have us back. I'm glad we haven't worn out our welcome.
No, it's funny. I think it was about a year ago we brought both of you on. And then I had you both on individually last year. Mm-hmm. And what I love about the relationship we've built with the Forrester Analyst is you guys do some great research. Ira pings us and I'm like, yes, I want that one on my show, Adrian, et cetera. You guys do great work. So it's a great way to get some of that research out to the broader audiences. So I love it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, same for us. I think it's always great for us when we're able to get something outside of the paywall, right, to kind of share it more broadly. We always enjoy that too. That's why we do the blogs and things like that we do. So coming on here is another chance for us to do that. So always have fun with it.
Awesome. Well, Future of the CISO. Great report. We're going to break this into 2 segments. When we were doing the prep for this, there was so much content. I'm like, we got to do a 2 segment on this. In the first segment, I want to talk about 2 interesting things. One is some of the trends around the role of the CISO, because you point out some very interesting kind of trends, discussion points at the opening, and then we'll get into the 6 types and some of that alignment. So let's start a little bit with what are some of the big takeaways on the trends of the role in general?
I think the biggest one that we're seeing right now is that there is a lot more maturity in the role in terms of understanding what the role is about, what it should be about, what you should be doing versus maybe what you shouldn't be doing, and what to look for in the role, right? The CISO role itself as a C-level role is relatively new compared to other C-level roles, right? It's been around for about 30 years now. If you look at CFOs or, CEOs, they've been around substantially longer. And naturally with a newer role like that, there's just a lot more, or there's a lot less clarity with what the role is all about. So I think one of the big trends is that we're finally really starting to understand the ingredients, the sort of necessities for a CISO to really be successful. And I think that we didn't have that because we were all kind of figuring it out over the last few years, over the last couple of decades, maybe. And so that's one of the big trends I think out there that I've noticed is that there's more maturity in the role. There's more visibility in the role. That's coming with some problems we'll discuss as part of this. Jess, I don't know any particular trends you want to identify that you're seeing.
No, and there has been more visibility in the role, but I don't think that the role has actually elevated itself much further than it has, 3 years ago. And I think that's where we're seeing some of the problems is that there's all the visibility, there's all the responsibility, and then there's really none of the authority. And, honestly,
I'd say 5 to 10 years ago,
Yeah.
Jess. Like I would 2 to 3
Yeah,
years.
I mean, I'm trying to be generous, but it hasn't really changed, right? It's still in many cases a glorified director, not a corporate director, but just a director level position. And I think that is problematic for security programs and for security postures for organizations all over.
Yeah, one of the things we cover on the show a lot is leadership communications article, and we talk a lot about the CISO and the seat at the table or not having the seat at the table. Because it's funny is you read these articles, they've elevated the role, they have a seat at the table, but then when you look at reality, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things in your research as you talk about the types is certain types might have a seat at the table and other types will never have a seat at the table. And I think that's really interesting. And I think people have to understand that it's not all or none in this case.
Well, I think one of the interesting things in the article too is you talk about it in kind of the front side of the article is under the performer CISO lose touch with reality security. You called out that CISO name only ruled by another leader, and I think in that you actually call out like the CIO itself may not really have any power, right? And I think it's weird how that tech stack. It's actually almost anything related to tech, unless it's related to the sales motion, right? The income of the company is kind of sat to the side in a lot of cases. And it's this, you're not part of the business, right? Let's be serious. The business is about making money and you're just an annoyance about overhead. And I think that's a struggle. A lot of, traditionally, it was the CISO reporting to the CIO. While that's changed, I still think that for whatever reason, that tech bias exists in many companies.
Oh, 1,000% it does. And then this is where I'm going to try not to get my soapbox out or have my Apple Watch yell at me for blood pressure and heart rate. Because this one gets me going. Because one of the things I
took medication ahead of this call.
Well, maybe I should have, right? It probably would have been better for me, made me a little more understandable. But this is one of my passion topics. I've been beating this drum for 3 years now. Poor Jess has lived this with me to some extent and been a great source of encouragement, but also probably frustration from her part at me saying it yet again. I think that one of the biggest challenges CISOs have is that I would argue that CISOs are now absolutely contributing to revenue in ways that they don't always know and they very, very rarely prove. And that's one of the big challenges because I think when you can show that you're not a cost center, when you can show that you're actually a profit center and contributing to the bottom line, then that's really where you start to unlock that seat at the table because you're showing that, again, you're part of profitability, you're part of revenue. Unfortunately, for a lot of CISOs, they don't capture the fact that they do that. And so a big part of what we focused on over the last few years is helping them actually be able to prove that on a day in, day out basis and how they do it.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is depending on where you report in the organization, it's not that easy to contribute to that, right? Like to Ben's point, like if you're reporting to the CIO and you're under the technology arm and you can't work with the rest of how do you even do that, right? And so I think a lot of this boils back down to the different types of CISOs, what the organization wants and looking for. How do you then, align yourself to that? Because if you want the seat at the table, there's only 2 or 3 CISO types that will eventually have the ability to do that, right?
Yeah, 100%. That's what we see time and time again, that really getting that seat in the C-suite at that executive table and being a part of that, it requires you to be a couple of those different types. I think that's where we see the most success. So it probably makes sense for us to kind of queue up and talk through maybe what those 6 types are. So starting a few years ago, we kind of sat down and profiled CISOs into these 6 types. And ultimately what we found within those is that there were some sort of definite categories that CISOs fell into. The first and most common, or maybe most interesting that we find out there, is the transformational CISO. And that's someone that comes in to turn around a security program, or often is the first security leader that's building out a security program for an organization. So that's kind of that transformational CISO. Then you've got the operational CISO. And those tend to stay pretty close to their tech and their process roots. Often, if you're a first-time CISO, you might find yourself being an operational CISO, that second type, because you're still pretty close to the technology. You've got the compliance and risk expert, that GRC expert that's really, really well versed in all of the compliance regulatory standards out there. So that's kind of the third type. The fourth type is the steady state CISO. And that's someone that is really there to kind of course correct, incremental improvements, really sort of guide the organization through, but not have to forklift and change everything out. The fifth type is the customer-facing CISO, and that's one that folks probably understand from tech and even cybersecurity, where you've got a CISO that's much more customer-facing. Those are ones that are driving a lot of revenue. And finally, the sixth type is the post-breach CISO. And that's the person that's often brought in after that mega breach, that's handed a lot of authority, a lot of power, because the company's recovering from a very, very visible incident. And so those are kind of the six types at sort of a high level, and we'll dive into a little bit more about each one, I'm sure, as we go on.
And when you're talking seat at the table, it's pretty, I think you can probably already see this, right, Matt? The ones that are going to be at the table are obviously post-breach, because they're going to be running the show, but also transformational and also customer facing, because if you're a customer facing CISO, there's probably been an acceptance in your organization that you do contribute to revenue, and that there has been some sort of a light bulb moment. You might even be called a chief trust officer in some cases, right? And that's research that Jeff wrote about in a role he wrote about a couple of years ago. And we're seeing more and more of those, especially in high tech. But where you're not going to have a seat at the table is, and these aren't necessarily bad CISO types. There are no bad CISO types. We are just noting the archetypes based on all the conversations we've had in the decade plus that we've been working with CISOs, and the data that we've gathered that we'll share a little bit about the job descriptions. It's pretty easy to tell what a company is looking for. So operational, steady state, potentially risk and compliance, probably not going to have a seat at the table, right? And I just had a conversation with someone I would consider an operational CISO. He was on with the CIO, mid-sized organization. Not going to reveal too much about it, but the CISO was not involved in the cyber insurance renewal process and had to beg to be a part of it. And guess what? The premium got reduced and the coverage got expanded. And they were sitting there like, why didn't you ask me, right? So these are some of the scenarios that CISOs find themselves in, and you may not be the right type of CISO for that organization, or you may have to push the organization to change what kind of CISO they're looking for.
Well, it's funny because as a CISO, like you'll have those epiphany kind of style moments, and you'll be sitting in the room, and everybody will go out like, "Oh, wow, there's going to be change." Yeah, no, there's no change. Like it's a very deep cultural thing that has to change, and I think a lot of people going into the role don't understand how much culture has an impact and how much they have to be change agents of culture if it's not the right culture. But it's super hard to get that done, especially if you don't have the right buy-in from the top. If the CEO is not on board, if they don't want to change the culture, that's a push uphill that you're probably not going to win.
And that's why it is so important, if you're thinking about that transformational opportunity or you're taking your career in that direction, you probably want to confirm that if they're looking for a transformational CISO, that the reporting structure is right, that you're going to roll into the CEO instead of the CIO, because otherwise transformation might be impossible. By the same token, Jess and I have talked to some leaders that would very much consider themselves a steady state CISO. And one of our favorites is one of our CISOs that we've worked with for years, much closer to retirement, doesn't want to spend his time trotting around the globe, going to different global offices, that sort of thing. So he's very much kind of ensconced himself as steady state because he's like, look, I want to be around for the grandkids. I want to retire very soon. If this company decides they need transformation, they're going to need a different leader because I've done that. I lived those battles. I dealt with that world. Now I'm very, very happy being a CISO that's going to get this company through my tenure. And what I'm spending my time doing on top of steady state is mentoring and hoping that we can find our next generation of leaders. And so to Jess's point about there not being a bad CISO type, when we find that there's a bad CISO situation, it's often because the type that you are or the type that you're aspiring to is misaligned with
It's a
the
bad match.
organization.
hmm
Yeah, it's a bad match.
Yeah.
And so then you just have a partnership that's failing because you want to be transformational and they want steady state.
And I've given this exact same talk, like, and it's funny when I read this, it was like the exact same archetypes of CISOs, right? And I remember talking about this, and it got a lot of CISOs or potential CISOs were interested in the conversation. One of the things I always like to discuss is, look, the company has to know or should know, right, going into the search, what type they're looking for. But often they don't. Even though they've written the job description, they don't really understand that what they want is steady state, and what they found is a transformational guy, and there'll be misalignment. But funny enough, the candidate, like the CISO, doesn't understand that there's an archetype, and they're not looking at that and going, man, I'm a transformational guy. It's a steady state org or an operational org, and I'm not going to be happy. Or I'm a transformational guy, but I want to hang around for 5 years. Probably unlikely. Right. Like, give it 18 months to 2 years and you're off, right? Like a steady state, maybe you'll be around for 5. But those mismatches of not understanding, like, one, what the company wants, but also like what you want to do and what your lifestyle is like. I love the fact you bring up the older guy closer to retirement, wants to spend time with the grandkids. Like, understand what that enjoyment of your career looks like for you in the right phase of your career, and match it up. So I love this discussion. It's great.
When we think about the three types that potentially report into the CEO and have the opportunity to get a seat at the table, right? Because it's half. How big is the target now on the back? We've seen this, right? We've seen the cases with Tim Brown and Joe Sullivan and some of that other stuff. How is that impacting the transformational CISO, the post breach, the customer facing? Like, is there a bigger liability in that reporting structure for those types versus the other three that may not have the same, I don't know, risk in the equation? I'm just curious, like, how does that shift across those types?
I'll jump in first, and then I'll hand it to Jess to talk about this as well. But I think for me, when I look at it, I think all CISOs are within that sort of that target, right? I think it can happen to all of them. I think to Ben's point about sort of leading that organizational change, I'd probably rather be a transformational or maybe a customer facing, because at least that way I can use those things that I'm hearing from customers. I can use those third-party risk questionnaires, for example, to talk about how, look, we're going to lose deals if we don't make security improvements. And that really needs to be kind of the message. So I think that unfortunately for CISOs right now, they're all under the microscope. They're all potentially within that sort of target of having something happen to them. But I know that if you're talking about affecting change to try and reduce the likelihood of that occurrence, you probably want to be one that's got more access and credibility at a high level, because at least then you might have a chance to make something happen.
Yeah, and just before you jump in, Jess, like to your point, Matt, about like, you know, the more connected you are, maybe the more risk. I mean, Tim wasn't even CISO, right? And I don't think he reported to the CEO at the time. So that certainly changed in the new org and because of the issues that they had. But I don't see it mattering a ton. And I'm interested, Jess, when you pick this discussion up, I see like the train getting heavier and faster moving down the tracks, right? Like, as people see that there's potential for litigation and shareholders coming out of the woodwork about stuff to minimize losses, like, I don't see this getting smaller. This is only accelerating because people are going to look at the potential meat on the bone here. And I think there's just more and more exposure.
Absolutely. It's not something to tread into lightly. It may not be a career path. Maybe somebody is going to end up stopping at the head of the director of the SOC, right? Maybe they're done. I'm going to steady state it from here because I'm
making good money. I don't have to be there as much as the CISO.
You know,
I don't have the risk.
In some industries, very good money for a direct report to the CISO. So maybe the path stops there. But for those who are willing to, you know, enter those waters, you know, we've been advising CISOs to lawyer up, right? For our past two, you know, top program recommendations, we have said this. We even found the license plate from Better Call Saul, right? That said lawyer up on there because it's important, right? And now we're starting to see personal CISO liability insurance. There was just an announcement that happened earlier this week where that is now coming out. And that is something that people are thinking about. There's your own counsel that you might need to call once a breach has been declared, not only the outside counsel, breach coach law firm that's going to be helping during something like that. And then I think honestly, the scapegoatism is probably more likely if you're one of those other roles, right? Because you have not been in the meetings, you have not actually connected security to the business, you have not raised the red flags that customers have raised with you that may stop business from going through, that may stop deals. So you're probably much more connected and able to speak the language of raising those issues that need to be resolved and making sure it's everybody's heard of them, rather than some of the other CISO roles who have not been able to get that exposure. And Jeff, I'm
Yeah,
sure you have other thoughts
and
on
to be
this.
clear, in the
Yeah,
report,
and
I think you talked about at one point. You said, look, you have to be mature to be the CISO and understand that it's not about eliminating all risk, right? It's about accepting
Hmm.
it. And I think being in the room, being at the table, like being able to have that discussion and say, yeah, look, I'm not trying to mitigate everything. Like, let's have that risk acceptance discussion, but let's have everybody in the room on board with
Right.
what that acceptance looks like, so everybody's aware, there's transparency. And I think that's part of the coverage that is going to protect both the individual and the company in the in the potential event that happens. I was
yeah,
gonna say unlikely, but I
and
don't know
the
how unlikely it is.
it doesn't seem unlikely right now, I think, for CISOs. And the other part of this too, Ben, to your point around this, and especially around sort of, the SEC requirements with item 105 and item 1.06 and those rules and things like that, is that, what's kind of insane about the SEC's action against Brown and SolarWinds in particular is that, so at no point was he a signatory of the firm's 10K, 10Q,
Yeah.
or 8Ks that were issued, right? He's not a corporate director. Not an internal director, obviously not an external, given he was an employee of the company. So the extent to which, you can hold some degree of liability for that is up in the air. And that's why, frankly, I think we saw massive, enormous chunks of the case get thrown out, thankfully, for all CISOs, not just for Brown. But the other consequence of that is that if you're not a corporate officer, it also means that certain limitations exist with you being covered by things like D&O insurance and E&O insurance, right? Which are designed to be that insurance in the event that you accidentally misreport, not intentionally, right? But if you're not a corporate director, then you're also not covered by those. That's why things like that personal liability insurance is now out there, because you're not considered a corporate director, and so you're not covered by those. But now what you're finding is that you could be held liable for something that you've said, or something that's been reported in a document that arguably you're not even part of authoring, and you're not signing off on, because you're not. That's your auditor and your CFO that's creating that document. And we actually went through and analyzed about 150 different SEC disclosures throughout 2024 to sort of see what the language looked like. And it was very fun to look at, but it was also sort of daunting because, frankly, there were things like companies saying that our director of IT is a cybersecurity expert because they have an MCSE plus security. Now, I don't know how far back you want to go, but I used to have an MCSE plus security in like 04, I think, or 05. I don't even know when that certification was sunset, or if it still exists or whatever.
I lost
that's
interest in the CISSP when every salesman under the sun seemed to be getting a
Do not get me
CISSP.
started.
Doesn't make you an expert in security, right? Like, that's
not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the other interesting takeaways that we did find in this, to your point about transformational seat at the table, was that what we often found is that the sort of second or third time CISO, that's when they started gravitating towards that transformational role, that customer facing CISO, and where they also were savvy enough from their sort of career continuity to understand that they needed to be negotiating reporting structure as well. So if they were looking, or they were reached out for a role and it was rolling into the CIO, Jess and I have heard directly from clients we've worked with that, look, when they tell me I'm reporting into the CIO, I tell them, thanks, I've got some folks I can refer for you, but I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
Because they understand that they need to have that reporting structure where there's no obstacle between them and the CEO. They don't need that CIO proxy because they've now learned how to operate at a level with other executives.
Yeah, Jeff,
so
I'm interested in that specifically because you said negotiate the role, and I think what you actually the way you followed it up is actually more realistic. Is to, hey, I'm not interested in the role, right? Because I've had found that, like, I've talked to colleagues, I've been in that discussion myself, where it's like, that doesn't really make sense. Like, what's the structure in the org look like? How is that going to work? And it's really hard to negotiate that. Like, that's almost a non-negotiable item. You may be able to negotiate a bunch of other stuff, but reporting structure is really hard. And I've often heard from the CEO, I've got too many reports, right? And they're adding people, it seems like, all the time. Right.
One of the things that I dislike most about the world we're in now is that whenever there's a new technology, we have another C-level title. There's another CXO because we have yet another technology. And I'm like, at some point, these aren't even real C-levels, right? Titles are cheap, of course. So, we'll make you the chief AI officer and the chief digital experience officer and the chief data officer and the chief, whatever. But the reality of that being a C-level role is generally not. We all know that enterprises need belly buttons for things, right? You got to have somebody assigned to it. Someone has to be accountable for it or it won't be successful. But I do think that's one of the other reasons why we advocate for CISOs, to make sure that they're not just that glorified director or they're not a functional VP, that they're actually a member of the C-suite and they're getting the right time, because that's something they need to develop their career in this role and in the next one. And some of them are lucky enough to work for great CIOs that want to mentor them and help them with that. But we also know that the reality of politics is the reality of politics. Sometimes the CIO that you operate under might go from a colleague to an enemy or an adversary in
it's
record
a naturally
time.
conflict role, right? Like those two things are almost diametrically opposed. It's sitting in security and looking at like what we try to protect and measure against is always the enemy of uptime. Right? In a way,
CIOs
we
are
protect
availability,
uptime, but we're also asking people to patch and fix and do things that directly contradict that uptime side. So, and you're calling into question like the first level of like, what did the IT guy do? Well, he did it wrong. Nobody wants to look like they did it wrong in front of the their other C-level execs or the board. So it's that conflict is just it's natural.
One of my favorite stories in this is I had a CIO tell me that they reported to a CISO told me they reported to the CIO, and they said, so I get 15 minutes with the board. So the CIO is there the whole time, the whole board meeting, the CIO is there. I get 15 minutes. They ask the CIO to leave the room when I start so that there's no conflict of interest. And then one of the questions I inevitably get is, are you getting what you need from the CIO? And they're like, they're out there. This isn't I can't say what, you have me in here because you want to remove the conflict of interest, but they're in here for another 2 hours and I'm in here for this 15-minute span. Am I supposed to tell you I'm not getting what I need? I can't do that because they're back in here. So you haven't
as
really
soon as they come back
problem,
in and that guy leaves the
agree.
room, the question's going to be, hey man, you just threw you under the bus.
They said they're not getting what they're not getting what they
he's
need.
in there the whole time. So he has relationships, right? And that's right. I think that's the biggest part of the problem, is that it's really hard for the CISO to develop relationships with the other C-level executives, which is really important, if they don't have face time and they're not perceived as an equivalent role.
Yep.
That just
absolutely
it cuts the legs out. And getting that face time is really critical. Just to have the discussions, just to have the common understanding, just to have the empathy.
Yep.
Yeah. I want to go back to one point before we take a break and do segment 2. From a negotiation perspective, you said negotiate your position. What else are you negotiating? You've got to be negotiating D&O, E&O, some sort of protections, right?
Personal
as
liability.
Part of those discussions. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is something that, is new. I don't think people are actually very used to doing this yet in terms of personal liability, but they're going to get there, right? So I think finding the right match first is the most important thing, and then even understanding if they're going to be open to that type of negotiation, because as you said, Ben, there's not really a negotiation. You can't necessarily negotiate reporting structure. They'll just say thank you, but no thanks. So negotiating personal liability is part of it, but I think that's also something that you just need to do on your own, knowing that you're going into this. You have to know what you're getting into, right? This is something that you might have to arrange, yourself in some cases, and make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and then kind of going into it from there.
And that can be a good thing to bring up. So let's say you go and you say, hey, I want personal liability. And they go, yeah, we're not paying for that. Mm-hmm. Great. I want a 5K bump in my comp. Mm-hmm. Right? When you're talking about the comp discussions, that's your justification of the comp isn't high enough. And here's why. I've got to get personal liability insurance. I've got this risk that I've got to take on.
I've got to retain personal counsel.
That's right. That's all stuff that you can make the argument then, right? But if you don't know about it.
And when you do look at CISO salaries, I think one of the things that's really unfair in terms of the way CISOs are comped is when you look at other executive salaries, there's very much a 50-50 split, often between base comp and equity, right, of various types. CISOs are still very much comped in a 70-30, 80-20 model, where the majority of their compensation is base and not based on company performance. And so that's another part of this where, if you're going to tie me so tightly to the impact to the business, then I need to be compensated as if I'm an executive that is compensated based on the performance of the business. right now you're compensating me based on my base salary, not the overall performance. And so we still see CISO splits where it's 70, 30, 80, 20 base to equity versus, 50, 50, or in some cases with CEOs, which is even more distorted than that. And there, in theory, there are incentive reasons for that. It's probably a different podcast where we talk through whether or not we agree. That's a different thing. But to your point, it's about negotiating all of those things and, trying to show that, hey, I've earned a seat at the table. I also want to if I help this company perform, I want to receive rewards that are equitable based on that performance.
And I think when you're looking at the company as the candidate, like these are all things that should be clues, right? Like if it's an 80-20 split, if it's based in New York City and they're paying $140,000 base, like you're probably not really the CISO, right? Like you may have a title, but you're not the guy.
Right. And we found that when we looked at the job listings, because we looked at it at a ton of job listings for each one of these. And it was actually, after looking at enough of them, it became really easy to start to be able to distinguish the ones that were, steady state or operational or GRC. In some cases, it was the first bullet. It became that easy where it's like, if the very first bullet is about compliance or regulatory stuff, they're probably looking for that compliance expert. It becomes really straightforward. And so that was the other part. And it even featured things like the amount of experience they wanted as a manager versus in the vertical. Like those were all things. So we looked at enough of these kind of in series and categorized them that it became a little bit easier for us to figure out, okay, based on the public information that a company posts, what kind of CISO are they looking for? And again, it was often very much in those bullets of here's what the role is going to do. If all they're doing is talking about regulatory stuff and GRC, do you love GRC? Because if not, unless you need a job, and sometimes, look, we all have bills, that may not be the best gig for you to take because that's not what they're interested in.
That's a perfect segue to end this one, because that's what I want to talk about on the flip side of this is that role alignment and those differences in the responsibilities and the experience, because I think it's really important for folks that are out searching for these roles, they understand that. And then I also want to cover exit strategies. So let's take a quick break and then we'll discuss role alignment and exit strategies for CISOs.